Welcome everyone to another observability clinic. Today's topic, Monaco 2.0 monitoring configuration as code reloaded. Really hot topic because we are shifting left and shifting right, and to do all of the cool things we need automation, and automation is better done through configuration as code. I don't know I know a little bit about it, but more details about Monaco 2 can be told by Nico. Nico, servus.
Yes, servus Andy.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, and especially now with this kind of next big milestone of Monaco 2.0. Nico, let's take it right away. What have you prepared for us today?
Sure. So I will tell you a bit. I try to keep the start short, do a quick recap of what really is monitoring as code, what is Monaco. I think around a year ago, you already had a great observability clinic with our colleague Chris, who back then talked about Monaco V1. And he has a great intro on use cases. So I will skip over that. If you want to know more about Monaco use cases and really how you might use it in your environment, go watch that old recording. Use cases are still perfectly valid. And I then really want to focus and talk a bit about what did we change in V2. So it is V2, it is a breaking change. We changed quite a bit. And I want to tell you the reasons. I want to show you the features. And the more interesting thing, or the most interesting thing, I think, is then seeing these things in action. So we're going to look at a small sample configuration, going to look at the configurations, and then we're going to look what does that do to Dynatrace when I type in Monaco deploy.
That's awesome. Yeah. And by the way, folks, if you're listening, any of the links, like the recording to the Monaco 1.0 session, links to documentation, to the Git repository, you will find them all in the summary, in the description of this video.
Perfect.
Cool.
Then I guess I would set very, very quick still on use cases. I just picked two. One, because it's mine as a software developer. So why do I want monitoring as code? Why do I want configuration as code? And here it allows me to go and take right next to my application the configuration for it. I can define the SLOs for my app. I can define, if it's a web app, synthetic monitoring and checks for it. I can go put that in version control, put that next to my app, and when my app changes, I change maybe some monitoring configuration, and I have a CD step where both of these things happen, roll out. I never get out of sync. I don't need to go and manually click for UI, which I really don't like as a backend developer. So it really just allows me to put my configurations right with my actual application code. The other use case or persona we really kind of focus on, because it's also an internal one, is a Dynatrace champion. We have it right here, or basically a person who really knows Dynatrace well and wants to set certain standards. So the thing we're seeing, and we're hugely having internal, is there's a lot of scale in configuration. There becomes more and more things that you want to monitor, more and more things you want to set up, alerting dashboards and so on. And configuration as code allows you to set standards and say, hey, here is these alerting profiles, these specific rules, this tagging I need on every service. I can go and build a template, and I can give it to all of my teams and say, hey, please just fill out the configuration YAML, and these templates will give you a good start in using Dynatrace. So these two are really, I think, really big use cases for us. Yeah. Again, I said I'm going to keep it short. What does configuring Dynatrace as code mean? Basically, for Monaco, we're always looking at configuration YAMLs, which allow us to do some templating, and then JSON payloads. And the JSON payloads for us is really basically the language that our API already speaks. That allows us to usually iterate very quickly. We don't need to go and translate API objects into another intermediate language and keep these things in sync. We just use what the API already understands, and we give you features on top with templating, with just building more things around that. And then obviously putting the two things together, my configuration YAML, my JSON template, I go and apply it, and it changes my settings in Dynatrace. And this I actually took from the original observability clinic for Monaco V1, but I think it's a nice picture of use case. Really have my configurations, I have my file, I very likely want to have some CD pipeline just as part of probably some other rollout, also deploys Monaco. And the next thing I have my stuff configured. I have my dashboards the way they need to look. I have my SLOs, alerts, and so on, all right there.
It's a great overview, and I also want to thank you so much for this quick kind of recap. I see a lot of people that have adopted Monaco in the past months and years, right? Really, the benefit of it is then when you really bake it into your automation like this and have your, I would almost not just call it Monaco monitoring configuration anymore. It's really observability configuration. It's much more than just how we get the data, but what you do with it, and then putting the configuration next to your source code. So your observability configuration is moving as your code evolves. It's moving with it, and that's the beauty of it. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that is also where we internally started this. It was 2019 when we started it. It was an internal need to say, we have built applications, we want them to be observable, obviously. We want to use Dynatrace to its fullest. But we, like a lot of people, we have staging environments before we go to production. And a certain level of configuration and alerting and observability, I obviously want to shift left and already have it in staging. If my staging observability system tells me something is wrong, it will probably not ever go wrong in production because I can fix it in time. And that's another really nice thing. I put my observability configuration in one place, and I can put it to all the environments where I need it. I don't need to have out of sync changes or have a different thing in staging than what I then would have in production. And yeah, as you say, it moves and changes with your application. Doesn't go out of sync that much. Right. I basically took the same slide that was already, I think it's the previous observability clinic or two ago, we heard about the Terraform provider. And was shortly discussed there. I just wanted to add the Monaco perspective in this question. I think we also get a lot like, when should I use Terraform? Why should I still use Monaco if there's a Terraform provider? And I've hinted at it. For us, mostly the technical decision to be a bit more agnostic and not needing to translate API objects. That I think allows us to iterate a bit faster with Monaco, and we always try to keep our API coverage as best as possible and as up to date as possible. And it's really, I think, a tool we built. We optimize it for our use cases. It's really meant to give you an easy way to get into configuration as code for Dynatrace. But as discussed already on the Terraform provider, if you're already using Terraform, if that's the tool of choice, I think that's where the Terraform provider already comes in. You don't need to go and introduce a new tool if all of your infrastructure as code is Terraform. Yeah, observability as code should also be Terraform. That makes a lot of sense. I think the other main difference I'm speaking to you now is the lead for the team that is really working on Monaco and has been working on V2 with focus since around August last year. Monaco is now still open source, but it is supported by Dynatrace. We have development behind it. We have official documentations. We have support enablement. And the Terraform provider is still an open source project that we do on the side. It is not officially supported, where Monaco is really, we focus on that as our observability as code solution.
Yeah, I think it's a great overview. And folks, if you are interested to see though what the Terraform provider can do, I will also put the link to the Terraform clinic in the description of this one.
Great. Then that was the quick recap. That was the quick, what is configuration as code? So what is Monaco V2? You saw before, I'm going to make some assumption that you have an idea or maybe how V1 looks. We're also going to look at it a bit more in the demo. We had, I would say, 3 main goals with 2.0 of Monaco. The main one being making the CLI usage and the configuration clearer to understand. A lot of Monaco V1 really grew organically out of use cases. Commands, there was one for a while. We had the demo version of how we structure into commands with V2. And yeah, our configuration was basically key value string mapping. We have changed that. We now have structured configuration. We're going to take a look at that a bit sooner in a bit. Second part, we try to decouple us a bit more from the file path. Monaco has certain configurations that look like file paths but aren't file paths. You've seen a lot of support cases where Monaco 1 is somewhat dependent where you run it. It looks at the folder it's currently running in. In Monaco V2, we introduce a manifest file, which then, that is our route. From there, you can define paths, and we always run from there. It doesn't matter if you run it locally, you're currently in the folder, or you run it in CD and you're 2 folders out, it behaves the same. That was, I would say, one of the bigger issues of V1. And then kind of the thing that is not related to the Monaco change, but to a Dynatrace change that we sadly did not support right out of the box, but we're getting to fully supporting the settings 2.0. So the settings framework allows now most of the configuration of Dynatrace. With Monaco V2, we will support it fully. And I think very importantly, the way we do support it is generalized. So you will not have to go and update Monaco just because we have new settings. Monaco just understands settings and setting schemas. And if there's a new schema, you can just use Monaco at the schema and you're fine. And in part, that is enabled by the configuration structure changes that we've introduced. Very quickly to the commands. We try to be logically, and they will probably grow with new things. There's still deployment as an explicit command. There is a download as we had in V1. So I can go and say, hey, here's my environment. I maybe configured it manually, but now I want to go with config as code. I do a Monaco download. I get these configurations. I get some preparation then. There's some references we replace on download. There is potential also in the future. It's going to be a bit more of things where we can just already structure and find matches on the download. Give you good configuration as code setup, not just the here's all the files. In the newer commands, or because these two you can already use with special settings in V1, deletion. So in V1, we had implicitly you do deploy, you can define a delete file, and after deployment, we will delete that. Which is not always what you want, and which if you just want to delete things, you need to set up a deployment just to go delete. Not very usable, so we've split that. Deployment doesn't do delete. Delete is an explicit command. It's not something that happens when you maybe don't want it to happen. And the interesting one that we're also going to look at is conversion. As said, it's a breaking change to go to version 2, but we wanted to make it easy to go to version 2. So there is a convert command. I can just point it at my V1 configuration and it spits out V2 configuration. So I would think there is no reason to stay with V1 once we're out with V2, because it's a really, really easy switch to, I think, something that's really cool, a lot better to use. Right. I mentioned 2 structural changes. I mentioned the deployment manifest. The idea here really is that in V1, we had projects very much just based on here's a folder, and we had a file that then defined environments. For V2, we combine these. So I have one manifest file in which I can tell Monaco, hey, these specific projects, deploy them to these specific environments. And that is really something that helps with scale, helps with structuring. You see it in the sample to the right. I have one department A project and I have some general project. They're on line 6. And that might be my department's manifest, but in the same source of truth Dynatrace repo, I might have department B up to department Z, and they could all go and have their own manifest, share some configuration, don't share some configuration, maybe have the same environments, maybe have different environments. So it's really just a structuring tool that allows me to explicitly and looking at one file, not looking at the CLI command specifically, these things will be deployed to these Dynatrace environments. So really just, again, structuring was a big thing and making things less implicit. And we're going to take a look at one in a bit of detail in the demo. the second structural change, and the really big structural change, we have now structured configuration files. So it's not just key value, relatively random, other than some special keys that you need to have. It's now really structured. There's a schema behind it where I say, hey, this application has an identifier, it has a certain type, in that case an auto tag, and here is my configuration with required things like the name property, and then there's parameters as a list. Could be empty, could be a lot of parameters. And interestingly, I would say also parameters are typed. So that allows you to really, I think references are the most interesting one. That's why I put a reference here. References in V1 are the thing that looks like a file path, where if I write a property that contains a config ID or maybe project ID / config ID / the name of the configuration .id, then that thing will be resolved to the actual Dynatrace identifier of this thing. Looks like a file path. It's not a file path. It's actually our namings and the things that you call in Monaco. It's relatively confusing. So here it really becomes explicit. I say, hey, parameter app name that I can use in my template is a reference type, and it's the config my app, which is a web application, and I want the name property out of it. So really, I go and have explicit parameters. It allows us technically also to relatively simply just go and implement new parameters because they're self-contained. They define how they look in a JSON, in a YAML, and we can define how they work in code quite easily. Already developing V2, we added new things that we saw, hey, it would be cool if we have a parameter for that. Yep, sure, let's spend a few days, we have a new parameter. And it's still an explicit thing that I can see, that I can define, that I can document a lot better than, hey, if it's this special looking string, then it's gonna do that. So really, I think structure and being explicit.
Yeah, I also think looking at this, it reminds me obviously very closely to what we do on the Kubernetes side with CRDs, right? We're getting closer to what people are familiar with anyway. I know there was historically a lot of discussion with JSON, YAML, like somebody like this, somebody like that, and but I think this makes a lot of sense that you are and the type support I think is great. It's very powerful. I mean, just by looking at this.
Absolutely, and you I think set the, yes, it obviously looks like something you might have seen if you use Kubernetes. It looks like a CRD. It's obviously, we use Kubernetes as well. It starts to feel reasonable to define things that way. And yeah, I think it can also go and be a CRD maybe at some point without a lot of structural change, because as you say, we're all, I think, as developers getting used to, hey, this is how you can do things in Kubernetes.
Yeah. So that means you're implying maybe, or at least the option is there that we see this as CRDs in the future, maybe as an operator that is then applying this, or something like this could happen.
But I would say, and I actually have it as a teaser at the end as well. We're definitely starting to look into how could I maybe go into more cloud native way of observability configuration.
Perfect.
Yeah. Just quickly staying on the type property that we saw in the previous one and mentioned, we have general support for settings 2.0. We achieved that via that type property and via the, I'm just gonna skip one, like you see here, line 4, this is a type API auto tag. Whereas I can also go and say, hey, the type of this is a setting, and then I just define, hey, this is the schema ID. This is the scope. Potentially also, this is the version of the schema. So setting schemas are always versioned. When we download them, we will store the schema, and that will make the settings API go like, okay, this is schema 1. Maybe I'm now using 1.5. It can do some internal updates and migrations and ensure, hey, okay, your version 1 now works. So really, for us, or for using Monaco, using a setting and using a new schema is as simple as saying, hey, here is schema whatever. Here is the value out of the JSON property of the schema, and you're good to go. We're supported. As mentioned, there is no, hey, Dynatrace has some new things supported as a setting. Now you need to update to Monaco version 2.1 to get that. And yeah, should be easy, should be generalized, and just allow you to add new settings as we start moving things and giving you new things that you can configure as a setting. Yeah, that was the high-level quick view at, hey, these are the things that are changed in Monaco. And I would say we're going to look at a short demo. Let's actually configure Dynatrace. I tried to think of something that is very, I think, real. So I want to configure a web application. I want to, I've drawn it into the box, make some settings in the scope of that application. And settings here really means settings 2.0 to really see, hey, here are the new things I couldn't do before in V1. For my application, I also want an SLO and I want a synthetic monitor, and I'm actually going to use that SLO as part of, or the other way around, my SLO is based on my synthetic monitor in that case. For good measure, because the other sample before that I had was an auto tag, we're also going to slap an auto tagging rule on there. So something I think we really see also as a best practice. It makes sense if I have connected things, putting a tag on there allows me to find it very easily again and see which things are connected.
Yeah, this is almost a blueprint, to be honest with you. What you just showed is a blueprint for every application that I want to see onboarded in Dynatrace, because you have the app, you have a synthetic monitor for availability check, and you define an SLO, and you're using tags to yeah, it's I may steal this.
Do that. I would add from a best practice standpoint, if you really view it as a template to maybe, here's a team, have a template, adding a specific alerting profile and notification rules that react to that tag, where I can then say, hey, this is application epsilon, and I know team A owns that. I can define, hey, they get alerts to this Slack channel, or if it's something critical, they get alerts to pager duty if the SLO fails. So as a template, I think alerting on top, and this is a very, very nice template of how to monitor a web application.
Yeah.
Right. For the demo, before I switch out of the presentation, what we're going to do is take a quick look at the V1 configuration, take a look at Monaco Convert, and then, yeah, look at our V2 configuration, deploy it, obviously, so we can see it works, and take a look at, hey, what else can I do with settings? And with settings, we can do more specific configuration now in the scope of an application. I do hope my alt-tabbing to Visual Studio works. I think it does. Right. This repo, I tried to keep it simple for the demo, so I will not put specific Monaco commands. The repo will be open sourced, so there should also be a link then, I guess, in the YouTube description, so you can go and try that out. I have in here just some command shell files, Linux specific, because I'm a Linux user, so I don't think I will add the Windows version. There's subsystem. So I think we're good with shell scripts. Else, these are really just Monaco commands that, yeah, I wanted to have a simpler way. There's no magic in these scripts to make the demo work. As mentioned, a V1 project looks like this. I have an environment file. I here have my environment just as environment variables that commands will also ensure are there. And then I have my project. I have my application. I would say let's just quickly maybe look at the SLO, because I will change the SLO later to a setting. And the V1 config looks like that. As said, I have general key values here. This will be my identifier, and this is the template file. So for my SLO, here's my name property, and here we also see one of these references, just as it looks like a file path is in the file path. I would actually just go on from V1 and go to convert this thing with my convert shell script, which is we can do, see, just as a Monaco convert. point it to my environment file, point it to the folder I want to convert, and my output should be converted v2. And here it is. And that's, as I said, the first difference. I now have a manifest file where I say, hey, this is the project. And still, I have the same environment, and I have it in a bit more explicit way where I see, hey, my URL here is also an environment variable. It could just be a value. I could just write it in there. Tokens, because we never want to give you a way to accidentally go and commit a token into version control, is always an environment variable. So that's the same. You just give the env name without any specific.
Hey, one thing I see here, just a quick question. I see you are grouping now your environments. That means you can have multiple environments in a group.
You can absolutely have multiple environments in a group.
It's perfect. It's because you have a lot of large customers that have multiple Dynatrace environments, and therefore you can, let's say, push it out to prod, but you push it out to all the prod environments. Yeah,
absolutely. And the interesting thing that is grouping is actually a feature that V1 already provides.
Okay.
But again, in a very, very implicit way. If your environment has a certain naming pattern and you give it, I can't even remember exactly, I think you give it the group name, a dot, and then the environment name, then you can address the group. Again, super specific. Hey, if the string looks right, then it's a group. Whereas here it's, I don't know, I would say like first-class citizen to say, hey, this is my prod group, this is my staging group, and these are my environments. And again, it makes it really, really explicit to say, hey, it's a group. I have all of my prod environments. Yeah, v2 config. Let's look at the SLO again. I did not show you the JSON before because the template basically does not change at all.
Doesn't change.
Just an SLO definition. It has a metric expression. It has some success criteria. And I think in the extended demo, I change it a bit because there's some interesting things we can do with v2 here. But yeah, the configuration is very... Sadly, it is sorted alphabetically when we just write the YAML. I always like it personally that way better because it's more readable, I think, if it tells me, hey, this is the ID, this is the actual type, it's an SLO API in that case, and then here's the config. Sadly, config lexicographically comes before type, so type always ends up at the end. I would just find my SLO here again. Let's split them, and we have a view on both ends. It does the same thing in v2. Obviously, it does it in a bit more text. It does also more clarity and more precision. Where it does the same thing, and it's actually the sample I showed before in the slides as well, where now I have my reference type. I go, hey, this is a synthetic monitor. Here, the project is just automatically omitted because I don't need it. But I could say, this is project, just not necessarily because it's the project I'm in already. So on Convert, we're also trying to simplify your configs a bit to a degree where we can do it safely. Yeah, so here my type is a synthetic monitor, same as here. My config ID is the app availability monitor, and I use the ID property. Yeah, I think that is it. There's not that much interesting in the configuration itself. So I would deploy v2, convert it. That just to now my fixed config v2 will go and create me some new objects in Dynatrace. It more or less prints the same information that we've printed in v1. I can still, the demo does it, can still go and do a validation first or a dry run. Say, hey, is my configuration generally sound? Does this work? Or did I do something wrong in my monitoring, my config setup? And then I'll just go and say, hey, Monaco v2 deploy. And I just point it to the manifest. I don't need to give it a folder. I don't need to give it, hey, here's the environments file. From a CLI perspective, it becomes simpler because I have all of that configuration in one file. And having that in one file means also I have that now in version control. I don't have that definition somewhere in my CD setup or in the scripts I run manually, maybe. It also moves these definitions a bit more into a config as code way. Deployed our project to my one test environment, and it created us a app. It created a synthetic test, an SLO, and the auto tag. And if I alt tab over again to my test environment and refresh, then we should see here sample web app we've just created.
Perfect.
And of course also our SLO, which might not get data yet because
it'll take a while until the synthetic test is done and everything.
Usually takes a while to set up, so I would assume this tells us I am currently being set up. Yes. But yeah, that is basically that in Dynatrace. I would quickly from there go to the settings demo. And for that, as you probably know, if you have web applications that you monitor and real user monitoring, there's quite a few configurations that you want to do in the scope of this created application. In that specific case, let's say I want to actually do some cost control. By default, I do real user monitoring for 100% of traffic. I don't do any session replay, but maybe I also want some session replay. These settings in scope of an application are not something I can do with Monaco V1. It's also not something we were able to do in a generalized public API way before we had the settings framework. Now we can. So for my sample, these are the things I actually want to change. I'll tap back to Visual Studio Code. I need to do one thing, sadly, and remove the things I have just deployed, because I figured it would also be a great idea to move the SLO to a setting, which means I cannot directly update it from the config I previously created, because they're slightly different. Which I might clean that up before we actually make that public, so you could go and deploy your converted one and then just do the settings changes as a update rather than recreating. For now, I'll delete it, do an update later. One more thing I did in here, as you can see in V1, we're really depending on the folder name to say, hey, this is a web application. There is no place in the YAML or in the JSON that would tell Monaco that this is a web application. We already saw in V2, I actually tell it, hey, the type is web application. So this allows me to structure things differently. That is, I don't know, not necessarily a suggestion to structure things that way with Monaco V2. For bigger configs, it probably still makes sense to keep it more explicit. And when we download, we also still give you the folders sorted per API, just for some clarity. But I could go and define a project differently and say, hey, here is my app configuration. And actually split here in, here is still my auto tag. Auto tagging is pretty boring, other than, hey, it's a setting now. And I just say, hey, I forget what exactly the tag defines. More interesting thing is the application config, where I say, hey, here's my one file, and I put all of the configurations I want to do in scope of that application in there. So I still have my web application. It's not too interesting, just gets a name. Here it gets interesting. Here we're getting to our ROM settings, where on one hand we see, hey, this is a settings schema built in from web enablement, and it's something I want to do in scope of my API, of my actual application. I might go and put, I don't know, something like application, whatever its ID might be if I know it, and if it's not, created, where I get problems in, this might be different environment. I can go and say, hey, the scope is actually also a reference type, looks exactly the same as the reference type parameter we saw before, and it's for an application web type with the ID my app, which thing I define up there. So now I go and Monaco will, based on the reference, be able to first create the app and then go, okay, here's this schema in scope of whatever the idea of that app will be, and apply it to my application. And what I do in these settings, as mentioned, I have ROM, I want to turn it on, and I want to have 100%. The second different thing you see here, this is a value type. So I actually define this in a bit of a structure. I could still go and say ROM enabled is true. I could say ROM percentage is 100, but if I want to, I can also go and group things and create a bit more complex values where visually I think here it really becomes clear, hey, this is ROM. Yeah. And I have an enabled settings, I have a percentage settings. These things are kind of related. Where I can do that in a simpler way. It's a bit of a constructed example here.
And that means you can then reference the object and the individual values. Like, oh yeah, perfect.
What I would do here is really just say, hey, this is ROM, and out of ROM, I move it. I have the enabled property. I have the percentage property, and really the same for session replay. It's really just, again, with the introduction of types, we can give you just more things that you could use, you don't have to use, but it just gives you here a grouping. And yeah, then I've just added one more. I don't know, maybe I have some file where I know, hey, here's some requests that go against there, but it's actually not there. It might also be my icon, because I don't have one, but I know browsers will do a request. You can say, hey, this is an error I don't want alerting for. I want it ignored. Again, it's a setting in the scope of my application. To actually see this, I would deploy v2 settings, I think I called it. Yes. Which again shows us here that sometimes it takes a while for an application to be available. So we've just created it and the synthetic doesn't find it, which means we will probably do 1 or 2 retries and then we'll have found it.
But it's also great. This is also what Monaco is basically doing. If you have depending objects, it really makes sure that these depending objects are fully set up in Dynatrace. Yeah.
Yes, in development. It's really also, we have, I would say, by now a lot of knowledge of the Dynatrace APIs, and we have obvious direct connections to teams working on APIs. We are able to build things that make it a bit easier to use. In that case, we know that exact thing. It sometimes takes time to create an application, or takes some time to create a synthetic monitor. So these are places where we can retry, and where we also apply different times of retries, knowing different configurations that might be there quickly and some that take some time. So here we have created basically everything we wanted. And I'll tap back. I should now just go back, because it's probably a new application. And if I go back to edit, we will see that we actually do 100% of user monitoring and session replay. And to show you the update case as well, let's say, hey, session replay is cool, but it's actually a bit expensive and I don't need it for everything. I can go and say here on my config log, hey, let's change that to 50. New value will go into the JSON payload. And Monaco can actually go on my next deployment run. We see here it basically updates everything. In the cases other than the ROM setting, it doesn't change anything with the update. So with our ROM setting, I now see, hey, my custom traffic control is reduced. And again, I have that in a code way. I don't need to click my way through UI, and I have it reproducible. Or maybe even the user accidentally changed it, set it back. Next time I do my deployment, it will be the correct thing again. It will be the thing I defined in code.
Hey, when you now do me the favor in the Dynatrace UI quickly, as you're there on the top right with the 3 dots.
Yes.
if you go to the revision history, I guess, or the schema info, the revision history is interesting. You should see this. Yeah,
For
that's
the
awesome.
revision history, we should see. Yeah, right. There are
That
no
things have
dates
changed.
because here we've
Yeah,
created it.
yeah,
Here we see our revision from
that's
100
awesome.
to
Yeah,
50. We see in that case the user here being the access token that I'm using for
yeah,
Dynatrace.
yeah.
Whereas I guess if I go and change it manually, set I want
It's also
75.
a great new capability. Obviously, of the new settings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Here I will see. It's also in general, settings are sometimes a bit complex, and I would assume you will want to use settings now with Monaco 2. You can also get basically information here. Say, hey, I'm in here. I'm in my application. I want to make this a config as code thing. What is the schema? I can go and get some info and will tell me, hey, here is the schema ID. Internal information of who these people are. You also see basically on the versions, right, who changed it. Yeah, really, really cool. And I think there's some more cool things coming really with the settings integrations in here.
Awesome.
Right. That would be in general, I would say, the live demo. Unless, Andy, is there anything you feel maybe we should take a closer look at?
There's one question that I have, especially with the settings schemas. Now, let me ask you, you still have to specify a template, or wouldn't it be possible in the future to the template is not necessarily needed, I guess, anymore if you reference the schema, assuming that whoever defines the parameters is really then specifying the parameters based on the schema. But have you thought about actually, because this can probably be just generated on the fly?
Currently, you still need to specify the template. I would fully agree. It should be possible depending on how clearly defined the schemas are. I think they are in general. They tell you what's required. They tell you what's not required. So it could be possible that in some future step to simplify things, if it's a setting, we could actually get, as long as the names then match to the actual fields in the schema, potentially we could do away with a template and just get the schema, generate the payload based on the schema and your inputs.
But obviously, I mean, the great thing about the template is that you can use it as a template, meaning certain settings, you can, kind of globalize it for how many apps you create, and you don't need to then specify these default values every time in every app config. So there's great things about, obviously, the templates. I was just wondering about this, yeah. And one other thing that I had is, if you go to your manifest,
yes.
I know we have the feature where you can reference not only parameters from your YAML files, but you can also reference values from an environment variable. Do you also think about providing, let's say, group global parameters here? Right? If you think about, I may have an environment production, and I have one environment that is called pre-prod, and for both I want to set up alerting profiles, but maybe in prod I want to send it to a different Slack channel than in pre-prod, and I would like to specify maybe the entry point globally as a parameter here on the environment. Have you thought about this?
It is something we did think about it. It's not something we have on the roadmap yet, but I would say, yeah, we're aware that there's really use cases and there's potential to say, hey, some global variables. I also really like that on a group or environment level to have these global variables. I think when we discussed it, we were generally thinking I might have something here like globals and just define them on a variable level.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely something we are considering. It's not something on a roadmap yet. I think the one related hint that we're considering that these things might change and extend is we put a version in the manifest to also allow us to go and change it. Best case, it's going to be a non-breaking change. So here, being semantic, just add new features, don't break any things. But we absolutely do expect that there are going to be new features. There are going to be extensions with ideas like global variables and so on, where we can just say, okay, let's extend it. Let's give you more that we can now do having such manifests.
last question that I have, you mentioned is the 4 major comments. There is the you can export, so download, I think it's what you call it.
Yep.
You can deploy it, you can convert it, and you can delete. So I really like that you have an explicit delete now, because this was always a discussion. The download, just for my understanding, you can say download everything or download specific things. I guess you can you control what you want to download?
I can control what I want to download. Just check something very quickly, because I think I'm not using our latest release candidate here. Nope. With that version I cannot actually download settings, else I would have shown you that. But yes, I can do a Monaco download. I can say, give me specific API, give me specific settings schemas, give me a list of these schemas.
Okay.
Or I just do it plain and I get everything.
Cool. And yeah, this is basically also what you were just showing, that at the time of the recording, you have release specific release candidate out at the time when we publish this, and once you view this, all of the stuff, the links that you have available, they will be the released version, or the one that you can use. It's really cool what you guys have done. I mean, it's just awesome to see.
Great. And to download, just because you kind of pointed me to, there's one more improvement that we did. There are now currently two types of downloading things. I can go and say, hey, download using an existing manifest. So I already maybe have my manifest definition. I just want an update of things. Point it to the manifest, download, please, this specific environment. Or what we've also seen a lot, especially for the case where I wanna start using config as code. I don't even know how to write a manifest. There is a download direct now where I can just go and say, hey, Monaco, download from this URL. Here's again the environment variable. We really want you to give us things directly when they're secrets. But I can just go and say, hey, on the command line, without having created files before, download from an environment, and after that I will have my project set up, I will have my manifest set up. Basically, it removes I already need to understand how to write Monaco configuration to get Monaco configuration. And there's probably some more things like that where we start iterating and improving on commands or adding new commands that do specific things.
Cool. Now that's all from my side. This is a great overview of what Monaco 2.0 is doing. And also I like that you started with the conversion, because of all of our existing users, the conversion will be obviously very relevant. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's really, as I mentioned, conversion for us was really, really important, because we think 2.0 is super powerful, will become better and better. And we don't want you to stay on V1, but as such, it cannot be painful to convert. It must be easy to just go, hey, I have my config, I do a convert, and bam, I can use V2. So that was really a strong focus for us to make it easy to switch over. Great. So with that, I think with the bit of time we still have planned, if my slideshow starts again eventually. Great.
Yeah.
Just a very quick outlook. As Andy mentioned, links will be also in descriptions and so on. Next steps for you, if you've seen that, we will obviously have documentation with version 2. Also showing how this is really something we support, something we view as a product feature. That is just part of the Dynatrace configuration, not the GitHub page of V1 configuration. If you haven't used Monaco, if you're generally maybe also curious to, I don't know, add some new features, you have a great idea for a new parameter, it's still on GitHub, it's still the same open source repo. Moved now to the Dynatrace organization, where previous was on the open source organizations. Also that showing, hey, this is an official thing. We really put development effort in, but it's still open source. If you want to contribute some ideas, feel free to open a PR. And yeah, obviously, if you don't have V2, by the time this goes live, you should be able to download 2.0, not a release candidate. Worst case, a pre-release, but I would strongly assume by the time you see this, there is our official release. So go download it, try it out. And I mentioned one last thing. I wanted to give you a teaser also of what we're still doing. Obviously, we will keep working on supporting APIs. We know there's still some APIs we do not support, even though with settings, I think we have a huge part of Dynatrace configuration you can immediately do as code. There's still some more things that we are working on. So the plan is really to allow you configuration of Dynatrace, and not just configuration as code of the main use cases, but really all the things you need. And obviously the same goes to future APIs. New Dynatrace features, we want you to be able to, maybe not from day one, but day 2 of the new feature, be able to have it as config as code. Other things we've seen, I can like reference entities like that application if I created it by Monaco. Sometimes I need to reference things that weren't created by Monaco, that aren't yet onboarded, that already have some entity ID. So we're looking into adding ways to say, hey, maybe there's a service with this name, please get the actual ID for it because I need the ID, I don't know, in my SLO, in my loading profile. And then the third big thing really, we want to, as said, make Monaco 2.0 better and better and better and more stable. And really also work on resilience and have it, just a lot better, a lot more usable, a lot more production ready for our customers as we keep going with V2. And the teaser that we already kind of got to, we are going to start researching, going to start looking into, hey, what are maybe configuration ways in a cloud native observability space that are not CLI tools. So yeah, maybe eventually there might be some CRDs. And I figured this was the last slide, but it's not actually, because in the slide deck, which I would strongly assume will also be in a link, there is an appendix. There are quite a few details, quite a few slides I've cut on really what are the specific things in a manifest file. What can you do with a project? There's also groupings, as mentioned. All of that will be in the documentation, but there is a kind of concise overview also in our slide deck.
Yeah. And folks, for the slide deck, we will upload the slide deck to the Dynatrace University video. So if you're watching this on YouTube, be aware that the same video is also available on Dynatrace University. Under Dynatrace webinars, you find all of the clinics. And if you then find this video and you click on the resources tab, you'll get to download the PowerPoint. Nico, this was awesome. This was, I know you worked on this with the team for quite a while, and now we're there with Monaco 2.0 with all the new capabilities, and this also obviously with a lot of change is there. But as you said, you try to keep zero config for configuration management so that you don't need to do too many things to migrate. And it's really, thank you so much. Great overview.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, we're really, as you said, we've been working on it for a while with the team. And I'm really happy to get to present it to hopefully very soon have people download it, try it out, and also hear back if it's actually that much better as we think it will be.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. All right. With this, thank you everybody for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye.